So now I'd like to introduce Rose Timmons-Dawson. Rose has been the director of the Alexandria Library in Alexandria, Virginia for 12 years. Prior to Alexandria, she was at the District of Columbia Public Library, where she held a series of progressively responsible positions from change agent for internal affairs to coordinator for community youth services. Rose holds an undergraduate and master's degree from UNC Chapel Hill, and last year she also received her alma mater's Distinguished Alumna Award. So with that, Rose, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, good afternoon, and welcome to the Alexandria Library Sit-In webinar. As she told you, I'm Rose Dawson, and I am the first African-American director of the Alexandria Library. And so I consider that to be a true honor, and it's my pleasure to share with you our story today because it is somewhat personal where I am concerned. So this past year, the library celebrated the 80th anniversary of the sit-in. And we wanted to use, we're sharing today so that you can use what we've done and accomplished during the 70th anniversary, the 75th anniversary, and the 80th anniversary, recognizing that you want to celebrate all of your library's history, not just a part of it. You know, too often African-American history is overshadowed by the traditional history. So do you know when your library made its services available to its African-American citizens or residents or even other people of color? So, and when you think about when that happened, so who were those local civil rights advocates who made it happen? Who were those trailblazers? Because this presentation shows you how and why it's important and necessary to recognize those contributions. These are the stories that are kind of behind the story. And using the Alexandria Library sit-in as a model, we're hoping that you all will be able to collect some ideas and tips to showcase how you celebrate that part of your history on a shoestring budget. Because trust me, we had very little money. We're hoping to celebrate and share with you how our committees did their program planning and brainstorming and how all of that actually came about. So our agenda today, the overarching goal is to actually help you with your ideas, and it's never, a program is not worth anything unless you're able to prove at how you can evaluate it. And so if you can evaluate your program and recognize it, in order to do this correctly, then we are going to share with you how we did it during the 70th, because each year we celebrated it a little differently. We learned from what we had done previously and tried to grow the events. And so we're going to do this through starting out with the history of public libraries, the city of Alexandria, the significance of African-American events over the years, and then we'll drill down into the specific information pertaining to the library sit-in and how it's been celebrated over the last 10 years. All right, so the history of public libraries is primarily attributed to whom I like to call the library's patron saint, Andrew Carnegie. To me, he looks like Santa Claus. And so as an immigrant, Carnegie shared that he credited his success to having access to books. And so he built more than 2,300 libraries, which would later be commonly referred to as the People's University. But as an organization, we've been fortunate because while we had Andrew Carnegie playing Santa Claus in the early days, we were fortunate enough to get Santa Claus #2. Software developer Bill Gates, he had decided that he wanted to ensure that all people had access to the internet. And so through the Gates Foundation, most of us got our first libraries and our first computers, excuse me. And so we give great thanks to those two gentlemen. So let's look at the history of Alexandria. Now, all cities, so Alexandria is about 160,000 people. And they are very proud. We are very proud of our history in this town. So while we have, we're the boyhood home of General Robert E. Lee, we are also the boyhood home of the President of the United States, the first president, George Washington. I know you're thinking, what about Mount Vernon? But Mount Vernon is where George sort of hung out as an adult and in his older years. But that's another story. So you'll notice that between those two, we have a logo, the Alexandria Library logo, because in addition to celebrating the 80th anniversary this past year, we also celebrated the library's 225th anniversary as a library, because Alexandria was fortunate enough to have a library in 1794. Alexandrians love their libraries. And so we have the longest running library system in the state of Virginia. And you know, you love being first on certain things. And so that's another thing that we're proud of. But that's a story for another time. So today, Alexandria, yes, we celebrate our history. However, we're a city right now that has more than 23% African-American residents. We have more than 15% of our residents who are of Hispanic descent. And then we have another 7% who are of Asian descent. So we're a very diverse city. Unfortunately, this side of our history is very often not shared. But on the national level, when you think about African-American history, if you listen to the history books, the Civil War ended, slavery ended in 1865, and then nothing happened until Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement were born in the mid to late 50s. However, so if you look up here at my screen, 15 years before the historic Montgomery bus boycott by Rosa Parks, and 20 years before the historic sit-in that took place in Greensboro, North Carolina by the young college students from A&T, and then a little less than 25 years before the March on Washington, there were significant events that were taking place. They were happening all over, but more specifically in Alexandria, Virginia, we had our sit-in occur. The important thing is that we don't need to let those aspects of our history go unnoticed. And we're libraries, we're librarians, and that is what we do. And so it's our responsibility to make sure that before we help others record their histories, we need to make sure that we're looking inward and documenting our own stories so that those are captured as well. All right, the 1939 Alexandria Library sit-in. So on Monday, August the 21st, 1939, the earliest library sit-in was held. And it took place at the Kate Waller Barrett Library. So down at the bottom of the slide, you see the Barrett Library. So this library came about because of the perfect storm. Dr. Robert Barrett wanted to recognize his mother, Dr. Kate Waller Barrett, who was a woman ahead of her time. And he offered to build a public library for the city, but the city had to secure everything else. So the Alexandria Library Company, remember that subscription library? Well, they had a collection of books and it was looking for a home. Those books were looking for a home. You had Dr. Robert Barrett wanting to build a public library. The library contacted the Society of Friends, and the Quakers were willing to donate the land in which they could build the library on. We won't discuss the fact that it's a Quaker burial ground, but the fact that they secured all three of the funding, the location, and the fact that it would be sustained by the city agreed to fund the library for $5,000 annually. So Alexandria's public library was born. And as you know, tax dollars pay for those types of services. But based on that time, not all of your residents or citizens were allowed to use that facility. And that is where Samuel Tucker stepped in. Samuel Tucker was a young attorney, and he decided he was going to challenge the law of where the use of public library or the lack of African Americans being able to use that facility. So what he did is he pulled together a collection of about 10 to 12 young African American men, and they actually practiced how they would conduct the sit-in by going to the library. So on the day of the event, you had 5 of the actual young men show up. They went in individually and they asked the librarian for a card. And when she told them they couldn't have one and that they would need to leave, they asked the question, what will happen if I don't? They went over to the shelves, pulled a book down, and selected a table and sat down and read. As you can imagine, this threw the library for a loop. And this went on for 2 hours. 2 hours, lots of people lining up outside, waiting to see what indeed was going to happen. For the city to do exactly as Tucker predicted, the young men after 2 hours were indeed arrested. And the picture you have on your screen is an actual shot that was taken of them coming out of the library and being arrested for their act of civil disobedience. So the library, we recognized we needed to celebrate it in 2009 and 2014 because those marked the 70th and the 75th anniversaries of this major occasion. And the thing is that while we knew about our event, do you know when your library system allowed African Americans to use their facilities? And this is one of the searches you need to go on because the Library of Yesterday was 2 libraries. Alexandria had 1937, they had the one library, the Barrett branch. But based on its time and the actions of Samuel Tucker, then the results from the sit-in were that they built the residents, the Negro residents as they were called, another library. It was quote unquote separate but equal, and emphasis on the equal, and it was called the Robinson Library. And so one of the things that happened with that is the fact that you have these 2 facilities, but what do you do with your history when you're not on the right side of the story? So let's look at our library today. So our library system today is basically 5 different facilities, but it's really 6 locations because my special collections library is located in the Barrett Branch Library. But my Beatley Library, for example, is a Michael Graves facility. They just celebrated their 20th anniversary. That's the sort of history that sort of rolls off our tongues. That's the sort of thing that everybody knows. And then where the other branches are concerned, the friends groups, they make sure that the story of how these libraries were built and how they came about the community is made aware. So what happens when one of your facilities disappears and goes by the wayside? Well, let's talk about how we decided to celebrate the 70th anniversary. So, the planning and assessment of the 70th anniversary. Truth be told, there was none. The Alexandria Black History Museum is where the Robinson Library is located in the Robinson Library, the former Robinson Library. Those are the offices of the Alexandria Black History Museum. And so over the years, they were the individuals who were celebrating that event. So when I asked my staff, how are we doing that? They said, oh, well, since they do it, we're going to partner with the Black History Museum. So as I received updates from them how things were going along, they shared that, well, the museum has a speaker, which we normally would do. They have a reenactment schedule. So they had students from Sam Tucker Elementary School scheduled to reenact what took place on that particular day. And that was pretty much it. So I asked my staff, well, what are we going to contribute? And they were very, very proud. They said, well, first of all, Rose, we've secured it so that you're the mistress of ceremony. So yeah, I was like, okay, that's great, but what else? So as with doing anything with the African American community, music and song is important. And so we made sure that a song was going to be sung. And then they partnered with, they being my staff at that time, so that was the local history, special collections department. They partnered with the Postal Service based on the fact that your post office normally does the Black stamps, your African American stamps. And while we knew we couldn't secure one of those, we were successful in securing a first day cover. The attendance was great on that event. But some of the family members shared with us that they were unhappy because they heard about it through by word of mouth, and they were somewhat offended that they weren't invited. And so that was one of the areas that we knew we were going to need to work on in order to make sure that our next celebration was successful. The staff were informed by me that while we would celebrate it in small ways throughout the years, we were going to do it big when the 75th rolled around. And so let's see how we celebrated it in the 75th. So this is where it is true. Normally, your director would not be a part of this sort of planning, but because I had a personal interest, I truthfully believe that I could not hold this position if it were not for the actions of those gentlemen, being the first African American to hold this title. So I wanted to make sure that we did it. We celebrated it correctly. So we started out where we had two committees. We had an internal committee, and that was represented, that had staff from the branches and departments. So all branches and departments were represented on that internal committee. And then we had an external committee. And the external committee was the group of folks within the community that we realized we were going to need for folks to buy into the fact that this was a celebration that needed to take place. Because trust me, we realized that not everyone was going to be happy for us to be elevating it to this status. And at the end of the 70th anniversary, one of your civil rights leaders within Alexandria, Ferdinand Day, he pulled me aside and he said, Ms. Dawson, I like your style. You need to keep doing what you're doing. So up until that point, I was told that this event had never been recognized at this level. So it was obvious that this was something we needed to do. The internal committee, they met monthly. The external members of the committee, well, first we got 2 honorary co-chairs with people who were real leaders within the community. So Ferdinand Day agreed to be honorary co-chair for the external committee. Former Senator and Mayor Patsy Tyson agreed to be the other honorary committee member. And then we selected folks who represented the NAACP, the Black History Museum, the school system, the faith community. So we had Shiloh Baptist Church. We still had the Quakers who were represented. And then we had businesses because we were hoping that they would be partners who would be willing to help fund some of the things that we were interested in rolling out. So the brainstorming that took place from the committee, we realized that if we were going to brand this appropriately, that we needed to have a logo and a tagline. And one of the nice things about that was as we had a graphics artist design the logo, and there were several of them, we allowed the staff to get involved, and they had a chance to weigh in and vote on which logo and which tagline they preferred. And so you have an image of what ended up being the logo and tagline that was selected. Alexandria Library Sit-In of 1939, a peaceful protest ahead of its time. So we knew we were going to have to publicize the events, because having everyone on the committee and having them all buy in, then it was a system-wide celebration. So every branch was expected to do an event throughout the year. It didn't matter when they did the event, but they needed to do an event throughout the year. And this little logo would be placed on the flyers or on any of the posters, so that as a person attended one event, they were told to look for that symbol for similar type of events. And so that was how we branded and marketed the program. We did a press release first thing in January to make the public aware, and we had quotes from those honorary co-chairs so that folks, the community, could see who was buying into this event, this celebration that was taking place. There was no doubt we could get proclamations from the city council and the mayor, and the committee had decided that we wanted to do one signature sit-in event. So on the day of the sit-in anniversary, we were going to roll out one big event, and that was where the city, the committee, did most of their focus. In order to try and drive foot traffic to our website, one of the things the special collections staff did is they provided all of the necessary research, and they put the information on the website. And they had done a lot of that for the 70th, but what we did on the 75th was we bought the domain name librarysitin.org. And by doing that, we bought .net, we bought whatever library sit-in was available, we purchased it. And that helped drive the foot traffic to our website. Those old pictures that you have within your library systems, in your special collections, we selected those pictures and we designed and created a postcard that we'll talk about a little later on how it was used. And then we created an exhibit. It was a 9-panel exhibit, and it's located behind me, 2 of the panels. And that was based on the fact that we were hoping to eventually have this become a traveling exhibit. And you can't have a celebration without having giveaways. And so, of course, we had things to give away. And the other major emphasis was this is a historic town, and you see historic markers all over the city. And we wanted to make sure that we submitted an application and secured one. And then, of course, the city itself has wayfinding signs. And so we wanted to make sure we were a part of that as well. So with implementation, some of the most basic things that you can do. So back in the day, when we were celebrating the 75th in 2014, we were still doing receipts, and people were asking for their receipts when they checked out. And so basically, at the bottom of the receipt, we put celebrating 75 years of the Alexandria Library sit-in. Wherever we could market the event or brand it, trust me, that's what we were doing. The direct mailer postcard, well, we took that postcard, we went over to the visitor center within Alexandria, and we basically gave them to them and said, look, while maybe a lot of people aren't mailing postcards anymore, but they're always looking for a souvenir. And so we were hoping that people would take the postcard and it would possibly make them curious enough to come walk the 3 blocks over to visit the Barrett Library. And so those were the types of basic things that we were able to do successfully. As an aside, I brought the postcard with me to ALA that year and asked colleagues and friends as I handed them out. We're sort of doing this like Flat Stanley. You all remember Flat Stanley. So I asked them if they wouldn't mail the card back to me, or you could visit our website where we had a map. We had a map up, and we were asking people to let us know who had become aware of our story and where they were from. So those tourists were encouraged to come on and visit. And before the end of the celebration, we were able to identify that the card and our story had hit more than 30 different states, and it had actually visited more than 4 or 5 different countries. We made a point of, with the programming, remember everyone was doing programming, but like many of you, we have signature events. So I know those events that you do every year and you celebrate, then you need to make your event a part of those programs. So for example, we had the Latour, the bike tour. And this is where folks would get on bikes and they would ride across the city and visit one of the public libraries. And then they would actually get a description or a little discussion pertaining to the sit-in. As well as visiting some of the other things such as Sam Tucker's office and where City Hall was, where the jail was that they took the young man, and that sort of thing. And it was very successful. We then, like many of you, do an all community read. And so our one book, one city read is called All Alexandria Reads. And that's where we actually read When Washington Was in Vogue, and it tied into the time period in which the sit-in and the other African-American celebrations over the years and milestones had occurred. And then we also selected books for teens and children that sort of tied in as well. So we had things such as Christopher Paul Curtis's Bud Not Buddy as one of the recommended titles. Harlem's Blackbird was another one that we gave to the folks to read. And so just making the events that you already do become a part of the celebration worked wonderfully for us. Now, when it came to the other programs that we did, the signature program, which is what the images we have right here, we closed off the street in front of the Barrett Library. We got a stage from our partners with Parks and Recreation. We had a band show up, and there was music that was being played. We had 15 nonprofit agencies who had tables, and they were flanking each side of the street, and they were highlighting for the community the types of programs and services that they offered. You'll see that this was August, it was hot. We had a tent, thanks to Parks and Recreation, but we also had children because they brought their kids who were in camp to show up. The historic marker that we were interested in, we unveiled it at that particular event. The gentleman up on the stage is Ferdinand Day, our honorary co-chair, and we had guest speakers. We initially were struggling to get one, and by the day of the event, we had two. So Dr. Frank Smith, who is the founder and CEO of the African American Civil War Museum, is on the left in a yellow tie. And then we had Patricia Timmons Goodson, who had just been appointed by President Obama as a commissioner on the Civil Rights Commission. And then we had our mayor, Bill Ewell, and we had Senator Rob Krapika, who also participated in the event. The people who have the ribbons around their neck actually ended up being family members of Sam Tucker who showed up. Once again, we had difficulty finding and contacting family members of the participants of the sit-in, and this was going to be one of those things that we really, really were seriously concerned about. But one of the nice things is that the faith community participated. So we had one of the Shiloh Baptist Church had a quintet show up, and we also fed people. So the food trucks that the city was trying to encourage businesses along those lines, we provided breakfast for the early morning event, and then this was our afternoon activity. And so we had another food truck that provided for the afternoon, provided lunch. The insert that you see here also includes the library board. We made sure that it showed that they were also celebrating this occasion. Gwenday Fuller is the African-American female who was on my board at that time. And so what we did with the board members, because the board doesn't actually, when you look at the board, doesn't represent the community, but they were very supportive of the event. And so when they were asked to decorate the Christmas tree down in City Hall, what we did was we took the pin the lapel pin, and we decorated it, and so that it became an ornament, and each of them hung an ornament on the Christmas tree. The exhibit panels behind me were then showcased in City Hall at a particular time, so any visitors who were coming to the farmers market would also get a chance to see the traveling exhibit. So once again, the giveaways. It's no fun if you don't have any swag to share with folks, especially when you're trying to help young people learn. And so we had a giveaway bag that had pens and pencils and things of that nature. But out of obscurity was the DVD video that was created in the 90s, commissioned by the Black History Museum to tell the story of the sit-in. And while the quality of that event, of that video is not the best, you have to applaud their efforts because they were able to capture first-person accounts, and primary resources are recognized on this DVD. So you have Samuel Tucker recounting his story. You have Otto Tucker. You have Buddy Evans, one of the participants. You have Catherine Scoggins, the librarian, so that you can hear her side of the story. It's a wonderful DVD. And it was one of those things that we tended to give out and made sure we made available to certain people who visited the library, but particularly when we did our outreach, we gave them to the kids based on the schools that we visited. And then our lapel pin was added to a specially designed thank you card that we tended to send to folks for allowing us to be a part of their particular events. So after we did the implementation, how did we know if our event was successful? So we evaluated our programs based on how well we received media and looking at our data. So one of the first things we monitored was how the cover story, whether or not we were successful in making it into the paper. We made it into the local Alexandria Gazette and Alexandria Times, but we also made it into the Washington Post. Digital media, so that's where our website. So how did we do where the website was concerned? Was the dollar spent purchasing the librarysitin.org domain names, were they worth it? Well, for us it was. We ended up with an 11% increase that year pertaining to the hits on our website and on our where the advertising was concerned. The digital displays within the library and the flyers increased the attendance to programs by 62%. And we were very happy that we applied to become a recognized annual event in Chase's calendar of events so that people would know that we were going to celebrate this every year. Now, where social media was concerned, in 2014, this was new to us. And so I must admit that this was not one of our strengths. We did put things on the Facebook page, you know, we posted, but we were pretty irregular about it. And if it wasn't for our keynote speakers on that day, they had staff who were following their events, and based on their speeches that were made, that's how we were even getting hits pertaining to Twitter. And this is just some of the images of the kids who were there on that day. But this let us know that this was an area that we would need to work on and improve. So based on the debriefing that we had from the 75th, we then felt comfortable. We also had 5 years in which to plan and to prepare for the 80th celebration. I don't want you to think that we didn't celebrate the event between those years, because we did. But we put a lot of focus and emphasis on the big celebrations, on the big years. And so for the 80th, we learned from the previous events that we really only needed an internal committee. They were the individuals who were doing all of the work. They were the folks who were getting the who needed to have the buy-in. But externally, the honorary co-chairs were what was important to us. And so we had former board member Gwen Day Fuller, Ferdinand Day's daughter, agree to be an honorary chair. And we had someone from the Alexandria Library Company, Brian Mitchell, who was the chairman, agree to serve in that capacity. And these two individuals, and having them, proved to be really beneficial, because when it came time to try and do some fundraising and interest in trying to get people to make donations, having them proved to be an important part of the plan. And so while I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, the Motley Fool is located here in Alexandria. And from one of our events, which they happened to read about in the newspaper, they gave us a check for $5,000 towards the Sam Tucker Fund and offered to update our books in finance in our collection. So let's look at the brainstorming that took place with the 80th, where we were planning, and our assessment is concerned, you know, if it's not broken, then why try and fix it? So all of those items that worked and worked well, we continued to do them. We updated our logo and kept our tagline. But the thing that really continued to be a challenge for us was engaging the descendants and the community. And we still wanted to place emphasis on this being a year-long celebration. So with implementation, what we did was we took something that was tried and true, that worked, and then we rolled out something new. So the direct mailer postcard continued to be a big seller, a best seller. Through the previous years, there were items that were sent out and given away, and every once in a while, one would come being mailed back from, we received one from New Zealand, which was a real a happy time for us that someone still was bothering to care about our celebration. But when it came to the new piece, you have to remember that during the 80th implementation anniversary, so with implementing this program at this time, the library was also celebrating its 225th anniversary as a library. And so it was necessary to strike a balance between the two events. And so what we did was we created the special library cards. We had the library card to celebrate the 225th, and it had its own logo. And we had the library card to celebrate the 80th, and it had its own logo. Needless to say, we ran out of the 80th cards, and based on demand and by special request, we will be bringing those back this year, the 81st anniversary, on August the 21st. We are going to allow people to get that new library card. So when we looked at programs, we went with one of our signature events, the Tried and True Bike Tour. And what they did differently was they blended the 225th anniversary and its history with the 80th anniversary's history, so that people got an overall look at Alexandria's history. This was a very, very good program, and I received a lot of emails complimenting the staff on how well this program was handled. The 80th Anniversary Film Festival, this is for those of you who think, well, we can't do all of that. We don't have the funds to do any of that. Oh, my peers will never be willing to do that. We can't celebrate it as a citywide event. Something as simple as a film festival. So the members on the committee, remember, every department's represented, they actually found titles. They had indie movies, they had documentaries, and they made a list of them. And they asked each branch, can you screen 2 of them and let us know which ones you think would be the best to do? You know the competitive side of people. Of course, several of them selected the same film to screen, and so people were able to see one of the more popular films more than once throughout the year, and that worked out really, really well. So it doesn't have to be anything major all of the time. You can do something as simple as a film screening. Now, one of the things that I should have told you with that basic film screening was that we received some really good press because of the unveiling of the Read posters. So the Read posters. Now, the one event that we said we really wanted to do was to engage the families. Once again, we were really having a hard time finding the families. For whatever reason, they were very quiet about the contribution that their family member had made towards this sort of event. It had been celebrated in people's backyards, I understand, but they weren't expecting a place like the library to embrace that side of history, because you've got to remember, hey, they arrested their ancestor. So I was a part of a committee, and I was sitting there with a historian, and he was talking about how he was happy to see some of the programs we were rolling out and that he had attended some. And I shared with him that we were having difficulty getting in touch with the family members, and he shared, oh, I know that family. Oh, I know the Evans family. Oh, I know the Murray family. I know the Stranges. He whips out his phone. He looks and he proceeds to pull certain phone numbers up. And he begins to call someone in which he's saying, look, library's trying to do an event and they wondered if you all weren't interested. So I was very appreciative to those efforts. But once again, not everyone responded. So you need to be prepared that sometimes, even though what you're trying to do is a good thing, I had an older African-American lady tell me, baby, you need to let those people alone. And so not everyone thinks that this is the right thing to do, but you need to go ahead and recognize that it's a part of history and the story does indeed need to be told. So I invited family members to meet me at the Special Collections branch so that they could see the documentation we had, the celebrating we had done over the years, and to help them understand why we were not going to do anything this particular year without their buy-in. And I'm happy to report that the two things we wanted to do Read posters and we wanted to do a Descendants panel. They agreed to both of those events. So you'll see that we tried to strike the iconic pose of coming out of the library with the Descendants. And then we have a great-great-grandson of one of the members as our youngest individual on a Read poster. And we put these posters up in all of our branches and with our sisters city departments. So you could find a poster in the sheriff's office. You could find a poster over in the recreation center. And of course, Black History Museum and the city manager's office. So one of the most impressive things that the staff did where this was concerned was the Descendants panel. So when on the evening in which they did the event, the staff provided refreshments. And so when I say refreshments, I mean real food. You know, you're asking people to come during the dinner hour. So we had, you know, the chicken drumettes and the chicken wings and that sort of thing for them to eat. We had the Read posters up, but we had unveiled a first set at one of the film screenings. And so we had standing room only at that film screening. So at our event, the Descendants panel, what happened at that event is the mayor was present and he issued the proclamation, but we had the Commonwealth attorney. And what had happened was a couple of days before the event, the Commonwealth attorney approached us because they knew we were trying to do research to find some of the records, their arrest records, the fact of the other things that would support what had happened to those gentlemen. Sam Tucker in the Out of Obscurity DVD said the records were missing, and I should have believed him. But, you know, I'm a librarian. I was like, well, he didn't have librarians working on the case. And so the staff then went searching for the information. And so when we ended up with the city clerk to try and get transcripts or anything from the case, there was nothing there. When we went looking into the police records to try and find their arrest records, there was nothing there. And so the Commonwealth attorney said, look, I'm willing to dismiss the charges and to petition the courts to dismiss the charges if need be. Do you think they still exist? I said, yes, I do. He said, if you can document that for me, I'll be happy to do so. So I contacted the family members that I was in contact with, and Morris Murray's nephew. I said, do you know anything? Do you know whether or not the status of the charges, whether they were ever dismissed? He said, my uncle said that the only thing he regretted was that those bogus charges were never dismissed. And so we used his statement to move forward on that, and the Commonwealth attorney petitioned the courts, and the circuit court had the charges dismissed. And so the picture on your screen is family members from the Evans, Murray, and Strange families and Tucker families who were present that evening, and they received a copy of the dismissal of those charges. That was one of the most moving events that I've ever participated in. It was to a standing room only crowd. We had an overflow section. You know how it is when you go to a good Baptist church and there's no more room to sit down. And so we had to go find overflow and make sure that folks could see what was taking place. And then we also were able to stream it because we were having to turn people away. It was a fabulous event, and one of those things that when you roll out these types of programs, you hear from the community how much they appreciate what you're doing. So how did we evaluate this program? Once again, we turned to our media. So we were in the Alexandria Gazette. We had a cover story and an inside article. So you'll see where that was the unveiling of the first Read posters. It was at the actual film screening. You would not have expected this sort of coverage from a film screening, but we had the descendant families present, and they told some family, and they told some family, and so on and so on. And so actually we were fortunate enough that the evening of that event, we were able to hit up additional family members and ask them if they were interested in becoming a part of our Read poster series. They were. Our photographer was there. We took them over into the room, took pictures right then and there. So on the night of the Descendants panel, we still had some additional posters to unveil. Now, social media, you'll recall that was one of the areas where we really knew we had to step up our game. And so what happened here is where we tied in the 225th celebration with the 80th celebration. And so what happened was the library had made the decision to circulate the American Girl dolls, but we specifically were only circulating the historic dolls. And so while we had a colonial doll to tie in with the 225th, we had Melody Ellison, who is actually the civil rights doll. She represents the civil rights era. And based on that, we had her visiting the Alexandria, city of Alexandria, and by way of Detroit. And what happened was we established a partnership with the Virginia Rail System, VRS. And so I had the pleasure of escorting Melody on the Amtrak train from the Union Station in Washington, D.C. She rode down about 3 or 4 stops to the Alexandria station. And because of the marketing and the press releases that went out that day that Melody was coming to town, one of the things that happened was parents shared this with their little girls. So when I stepped off of the train with Melody, I was greeted by a crowd of little girls with their American Girl dolls who wanted to welcome Melody to Alexandria. And so I did this brief impromptu talk about Melody and why she was here. So what we did with Melody is every day she went and visited one of the tourist sites within Alexandria. She saw Freedom House. She visited the African American Museum. She visited a number of not just historic African American sites, but sites that were historic to Alexandria. And we would post it on our social media. And we asked our followers, tell us where you think she should go. And so we had a great response where that particular piece was concerned. So basically, one of the things you want to make sure you do is after you celebrate this, you want to look back and see whether or not what has taken place will stand the test of time, because you're interested in leaving a lasting impression. So our sit-in descendants were with our sit-in exhibit. That's the panel that we hope will travel. It does within Alexandria. We are hoping to make it available in the near future to other library systems, because we're counting on you to help tell our story. And then of course our historic marker that sits off of Washington Street, and it allows anyone who comes by and gets stopped at the light to read about our history when it comes to the Alexandria Library sit-in. And then one of the things, because once you get into this and you see that there's so much you'd like to do and tell, you're not going to be able to do it all, and you're not going to be able to do it all well. But during your debriefings, you then see where you can begin for your next year's celebration. And so at this point, I'd like to share with you a video that captures our oral history series pertaining to one of the first African Americans who the library hired to work for them.
For those folks who don't know, this has been documented and recognized as the first sit-in to occur in a public library in the country.
I know.
So in 1939, local attorney Sam Tucker has 5 young men who individually walked into the Barrett Library, which had been built in 1937.
Right.
But based on the laws at that time, Negro citizens were not eligible or allowed to use the facility, even though their tax dollars were paying for it. And
yes.
Those young men went in there individually, knowingly they asked for a card, and they were told you can't have one, and they were told to leave. And they asked the question, what will happen if I don't? And they went and sat down, took a book off the shelves, and sat down at a table and stayed there and sat down and read. And it took the city 2 hours to figure out what to do with them. And then they were eventually arrested. So did you hear anything about this as you were growing up?
Oh yes, I knew. In fact, I knew Mr. Strange. His family lived about a block from my house.
Okay.
And so we grew up around them. They were, I mean, older than, you know.
Of course,
yeah,
of course.
But they knew my parents. And then I got to know who his dad was.
Right.
And yes, I did hear about it. But I'm telling you, even though they did that, I was in high school, I think, maybe early 8th or 9th grade. And we went to the Queen Street Library one time. Just walked in, went in the back, and they didn't tell us we couldn't be there. But they said, don't you know you have your own library, Robert Robinson Library? And we said, well, they don't have the books we need. But they didn't give us any service, so we left. I mean, they didn't just say you have to get out.
They didn't tell you to leave.
But we could tell they didn't want to help us, so we just left. Went back and told probably Mrs. Davis them that we couldn't get the material that we needed.
And so basically, I want to end on the fact that you need to develop a robust communications plan, because basically you are going to want to make sure that this story goes beyond just your library. You need to tell your story. Implement programs year-round and encourage system-wide participation so that you can try and get buy-in from your library staff. And then last of all, to ensure citywide recognition, you want to try and get buy-in from your constituents, but you also want to make sure that those individuals who actually left this mark on history, that they are recognized, and so that you don't want to leave them behind, and you want to ensure that their families recognize you, the appreciation you have for the work that they did. So I appreciate you joining me this afternoon, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Rose. That was really fantastic, and so many good and appreciating comments in the chat. I have a couple of questions that I have already collected. I know that we're running a little short on time. Rose, are you okay to stay about 2 minutes after?
I am fine.
Okay, great. So if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box now. And I will start with the ones that I already have on my list. First of all, I wanted to get us started with a question that is pertinent to our situation right now, of course, during COVID-19. If the library wanted to do something like this now during the pandemic, what would you recommend?
That's one of the things that we are actually doing. Our anniversary is August the 21st, and we currently aren't open. And while we hope to be open at that time, we're going to have limited capacity. And so folks, and we're not encouraging people to stick around. And so one of the things that a lot of you may be aware of is right now folks are doing the Bexley Challenge, so the anti-racial equity challenge. And so what the library is doing is we have put up things encouraging people to do something for 30 days. We're encouraging them to do a little something every day that helps tie into this whole racial equity issue.
Great, thank you. And Brianna also had a question. She asked, how did the history of the sit-in surface? And I believe she means originally, do you know anything about the history of when it was recognized by the Black History Museum in Alexandria?
So from what I can tell, like I said, my understanding is in the early days, it was only celebrated in the backyards of the gentlemen. So it was just a family sort of thing. The Alexandria Black History Museum in the 90s recognized it, and they commissioned the gentlemen to, these were young guys, maybe 17, 18, to do the video for them, to make sure that they were able to capture their stories. So as far as a formal celebration where the government or a city organization did it, I don't think anything formally happened before the 80s.
One more question I have in the chat from Renette Jones. She says, when did the libraries become fully integrated in Alexandria?
And this is why you need to capture your stories. When we were trying to collect the history on that, we of course came upon a couple of different times that folks say Alexandria did indeed integrate. So one of the former library directors says that it took place in the 40s, the late 40s. My staff, however, have been able to identify that it wasn't until the 50s that this actually took place. And it shows up within one of the board minutes in which they say that they have formally integrated. But if you look at the story that's told, that Miss Burke, Ellen Coolidge Burke, when she was director, she just randomly made the decision to integrate and was allowing folks to use the facility, but we're not able to find any supporting documentation where that is concerned.
Okay, well, I think that is all of our questions for now, and we are just over time. So I want to send a huge thank you to Rose for this fantastic presentation. And also thank you to my colleagues behind the scene, Bibi Brown and Hannah Arata. Bibi, if you could switch to the slide with the contact information, that would be great. If you have any questions for either Rose or for the Public Programs Office, please feel free to reach out by email. We know that we may not have caught everything that was in the chat. We will follow up with an email to everyone who registered for today's webinar, and we'll send out a link to the recording. The recording will also be available on the Programming Librarian website. That's programminglibrarian.org under Learning. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And again, thank you to Rose.
Thank you, guys. Bye.